progressives hate reason and data and science, it seems. And in fact, proponents of critical race theory will tell you, I think, openly that they reject not only all religions except their own. We've established that it's more or less a religion. Reason, the Enlightenment, modernism, all political systems, philosophy, and science. It seems to me there's a real problem engaging progressives in a debate around facts, around data, around science. I thought our universities, and I think people who pay for them, the taxpayers, thought they were places where you went to establish or to get as close as you could to the truth. And as a very wise, our leading historian, actually, Geoffrey Blaney, said to me in one of these chats recently, people worry about what's being taught in the universities, but don't you think the greater problem is what our children are being taught in their early years at school by the people who come out of the universities? Now, I don't want to sound like I'm down on teachers, although I'm certainly down on some of them, and on their union in this country and the way they've organised themselves because they push so many of these bad ideas. But he's making a point. What happens in our universities is terribly important for the rising generation, not only because so many more people go to university, but because virtually every child, if not every child, is shaped to a greater or lesser, and usually pretty significant degree, by somebody who's been to a university, and they are almost uniformly woke now. There's no contest of ideas. So it's not just a disinterest in facts. There's almost no opportunity for people to put data there because unless you're woke, you don't seem to have a place in the system anymore. How on earth has that happened? And what can be done about it?
Well, I think that's a fantastic question. I mean, I think that I have no problem with people arguing or disagreeing with me, or and I think universities should ultimately be about this contestation. But how did we get here? I don't want to go too far down the theory rabbit hole for your audience, but I have to. I'm actually writing a new book right now on the geopolitics of woke and decolonizing in the UK. And maybe when it's out, I'll come back on this podcast if you'll be so kind to have me. But basically, so the chapter I'm currently working on is looking at some of the theoretical twists and turns here. And obviously, I mean, people say, I would say one of the main ways in which we account for it is the dominance of what's called post-structuralism in the social science and humanities. I mean, if you look at a lot of the woke identity politics stuff, it comes out of this kind of, I'd say, this post-structuralism, which itself was a reaction against kind of Marxism, which was the dominant theoretical system in the university system for a very long time. So what are the elements of Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, in relation to sort of the post-colonial stuff, Edward Said? So what are some of the key elements of this? Well, one of the key elements of it is its fundamental rejection of this idea of fact and truth and objectivity. It's fundamentally what's called a epistemologically relativist worldview. In other words, there's no such thing as truth. There's no such thing as reality. There's no such thing as ontological reality. Essentially, everything is ultimately about knowledge. And the way we see the world, this is the key insight of people like Foucault and Jacques Derrida, the way we see the world fundamentally constructs the world. So that thing doesn't exist independently of me. The chair that you're sat on doesn't exist independently. Ultimately, it's constituted within a broader discursive system, a kind of system of knowledge, if you will. In that theoretical sleight of hand, we have then a fundamental rejection of scientific rationalism, but also ontology, how we adjudicate between different worldviews. So everything ultimately then becomes kind of equal. So there's epistemological relativism. All truth claims are merely floating out there. There's no such thing as truth. There's no such thing as a scientific standard. Ultimately, it's about the contestation of various forms of knowledge. And I think that also, so fundamentally, a rejection of the Enlightenment tradition of reason, i.e., judgmental rationalism, how you adjudicate between different truth claims. They reject that fundamentally. Everything's just simply about the way we see the world. And I think the second point from that is that I think that then helps explain why we've seen the cancel culture, because essentially, and the kind of policing of speech and these other things, because ultimately words then become violence in a kind of post-structuralist worldview. That by speaking, you're ultimately conjuring up sets of power relationships by the way in which you interpret the world. So I think that's been a big part of how we explain the rise of this in the academy, and then broadly speaking, when the graduates go through the system, this stuff. I mean, there's almost like a sort of what I'd call sort of, to borrow a postmodernist term, like sets of meta-narratives that sit within the heart of academia that almost just form the presumptive bedrock of so much of what then takes place in terms of research. So essentially it's the hegemonic common sense, if you will, of academia. So that the West is fundamentally, irredeemably bad and wrong. Okay, its history is one that's characterized by injustice, etc. Capitalism is fundamentally bad and wrong and exploitative. America is a corrupt and evil country. You see what I mean? So you can go and so that kind of almost forms the presumptive bedrock of that what then takes place within the university system. And so I think that partially explains, helps to explain, and there's no pushback against that as well. This is the key as well. I mean, if you have those ideas and they're well argued, and that's fine, but there's kind of almost a monoculture in academia where there's so little contestation of those ideas. And then I think the key thing for me is when those ideas have then been taken up by university administrators, as we've seen in the UK context, for example. So many university administrators, you must have heard famously about Stephen Toope at Cambridge, who's just recently resigned, etc. But it's very common amongst vice chancellors and those that are actually in power. They've often adopted these ideas and then begun to sort of percolate them through the system and impose them as a new orthodoxy. So not only do they form the kind of hegemonic common sense of so many academics, sort of uncontested backstories that just exist and are just commonsensically true, but they're not. They're radically contested. But then we've also got the enforcement of these ideas as a new orthodoxy by so many university leaders, and then more broadly within Western culture now, so the corporations have adopted these ideas, etc.
Did you enjoy this conversation? To keep up to date with new episodes, subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell.